The crimson liquid struck my chest with the force of a physical blow, splattering across the delicate white silk of my custom-made evening gown before dripping down my neck like a fresh, jagged wound. A collective gasp echoed through the grand foyer of the Sapphire Cove mansion, instantly silencing the elegant string quartet playing in the background. Hundreds of eyes belonging to the city's most elite socialites snapped toward me, widening in shock and morbid fascination. Standing directly opposite me, clutching an empty crystal goblet, was my mother-in-law, Eleanor Sterling. Her face was twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated contempt, her chest heaving with dramatic indignation. A pathetic little gutter rat, like you has no right to stand in the magnificent home my brilliant son broke his back to buy for me, she hissed, her voice carrying effortlessly across the cavernous room. Everyone waited for the inevitable tears, expecting the mousy, subservient wife to crumble and flee in shame. Instead, I slowly raised my hand, calmly wiped the sticky wine from my cheek, and let a terrifyingly cold smile stretch across my lips. The silence in the room grew suffocatingly dense, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of the vintage Bordeaux hitting the polished Italian marble floor beneath my silver heels. The stark contrast between the pristine white of my ruined gown and the violent, bloody red stains spreading across the fabric mirrored the sudden death of my 3-year marriage. I could feel the cold liquid seeping into my skin, yet my heart burned with a fiery, liberating clarity that I had not felt in years. Eleanor stood taller, her chin jutting out in arrogant triumph, entirely misreading my eerie composure as a state of paralyzing shock. She reveled in her cruel dominance, convinced she had finally broken the spirit of the woman she had despised since the day Julian brought me home. She turned her nose up, adjusting her diamond necklace with a dismissive scoff, silently commanding the wealthy onlookers to join her in condemning the lowly, gold-digging interloper she believed me to be. But she had no idea that the real interloper was standing in her own shoes. For 3 agonizing years, I had diligently played the role of Clara, the humble freelance design consultant who was supposedly punching far above her weight by marrying the handsome, rising investment banker, Julian Sterling. I had endured every sneer, every backhanded compliment, and every blatant insult from his family in the name of love, foolishly believing that my unwavering devotion could eventually earn their genuine respect. I had hidden my true identity as the sole heiress to the Vance global real estate empire, wanting to experience a normal life and ensure my husband loved me for who I was, not for the billions attached to my last name, but feeling the sticky, humiliating mess drying on my face under the glaring crystal chandeliers. The final, fragile thread of my patience completely snapped. The pathetic, forgiving Clara died right there in the extravagant foyer of Sapphire Cove. As I looked at Eleanor's triumphant sneer, my mind drifted back to the agonizing weeks leading up to this spectacular display of betrayal and entitlement. The nightmare had begun a month ago, when Julian came home waving a fraudulent set of property deeds, proudly declaring to his mother that he had secured her dream estate on the cliffs of Sapphire Cove. He spun a magnificent tale of his unmatched financial genius, claiming a massive return on a secret investment had allowed him to purchase the $30 million architectural masterpiece outright. Eleanor had wept tears of joy, immediately throwing her arms around her son while shooting me a look of absolute disgust, loudly proclaiming that no woman of my low breeding could ever appreciate such monumental success. What the arrogant woman didn't know, and what Julian had desperately tried to conceal, was that his supposed financial genius was nothing more than a spectacular series of disastrous market gambles that had left him drowning in massive debt. He had secretly forged my signature to leverage our joint accounts, hoping to use a complex web of shell companies to steal the mansion from its original developer and put it solely in his mother's name. Naturally, my private wealth managers had flagged Julian's pathetic, clumsy attempts at large-scale fraud within hours, presenting me with the undeniable proof of his treachery, rather than confronting him immediately and giving him the chance to invent another web of lies. I chose a far more permanent solution. I instructed my lawyers to quietly purchase the Sapphire Cove estate under my own holding company, effectively turning Julian's forged paperwork into worthless garbage, while allowing him to believe his deceitful plan had actually worked. Completely oblivious to the trap snapping shut around them, the Sterlings immediately moved into my property with the aggressive entitlement of conquering royalty. Helena instantly assumed the role of the grand matriarch, treating me less like a family member and more like an unpaid, indentured servant. She forced me to scrub the pristine marble floors on my hands and knees, iron the expensive drapes, and meticulously organize the catering for this very housewarming party, constantly reminding me that I was merely a temporary guest in her magnificent castle. During those brutal weeks of preparation, Julian's betrayal deepened into something far more sinister and humiliating than mere financial theft. Whenever I complained about his mother's borderline abusive treatment, he would feign a look of helpless exhaustion, placing a patronizing kiss on my forehead while begging me to just bear with her for a little longer. She's just excited. Darling, you know how much this house means to her, he would whisper smoothly, his eyes devoid of any real warmth or empathy. Meanwhile, I had secretly installed a discreet security system throughout my new property, capturing high-definition footage of Julian bringing his mistress, Isabella, into the master study while I was busy polishing the silver in the kitchen. Isabella, the spoiled daughter of a local politician, was the woman Eleanor actually wanted as a daughter-in-law, and they had all been using this grand mansion as a stage to finalize my replacement. They were planning to publicly announce Julian and Isabella's new partnership tonight, utterly convinced they held all the power and wealth. They believed I was utterly powerless, entirely dependent on Julian's fabricated wealth, and too blindly in love to notice the absolute mockery they had made of my life. Every day I spent in that house, silently enduring their cruel jokes and blatant disrespect, was another brick I laid in the inescapable tomb I was building for their reputations. I watched as Eleanor arrogantly dictated the guest list, inviting the most influential and wealthy figures in the city, desperately eager to cement her status among the untouchable elite. She wanted a massive, captive audience to witness her glorious ascension to the top of the social ladder, and she wanted me there specifically to serve as the ultimate contrast to her newfound grandeur. I gladly obliged her, every demand, meticulously ensuring that everything was absolutely perfect for the party, knowing full well that the higher she climbed, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally kicked the ladder out from beneath her. This night was always destined to be a spectacle, just not the one she planned. And so, the grand evening had finally arrived, culminating in this frozen, breathless moment of absolute public humiliation in the center of my own foyer. The stinging aroma of the spilled wine violently yanked me back to the present reality, where the whispers of the elite crowd were beginning to rise into a steady, malicious hum. Everyone was staring, waiting for me to break down, waiting for the impoverished, pitiful wife to run away in tears, securing Eleanor's triumphant victory. But the cold, dark amusement bubbling up in my chest was impossible to suppress, and the smile on my face only grew wider, more unnerving, and entirely devoid of fear. I slowly ran my fingers through my wine-soaked hair, smoothing it back with agonizing deliberation as I locked eyes with the sneering woman who thought she owned my world. The game of the subservient, suffering daughter-in-law was officially over, and the era of Clara Vance, the undisputed queen of this empire, was about to begin in the most brutal way imaginable. The tension in the foyer shattered when Julian finally pushed his way through the circle of gawking elites, his handsome face flushed with panic and irritation. But instead of rushing to his wife, who stood drenched in red wine, he immediately positioned himself beside his mother, shooting me a glare of profound embarrassment. For God's sake, Clara, what have you done now to upset her? He hissed under his breath, though his voice carried clearly enough for the front row of guests to hear. He didn't offer me his handkerchief. He didn't even flinch at the sight of my ruined dress. Instead, he placed a comforting hand on Eleanor's shoulder, acting as if she were the victim of some vicious attack rather than the aggressor who had just assaulted me. The blatant betrayal in his posture was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I stared at the man I had loved, the man who had secretly drained our bank accounts and forged my signature. Watching him desperately try to save face in front of the high society friends, he was so eager to impress. I simply told her the truth. "Julienne," Eleanor announced loudly, puffing out her chest and playing to her captivated audience. I asked her to fetch the vintage champagne from the cellar, as any decent help should, and she had the audacity to talk back to me in my own home. It was a blatant, fabricated lie, a transparent excuse to justify her violent outburst to the whispering crowd. But Julian nodded solemnly, as if her words were gospel. He turned his cold, calculating eyes back to me. His jaw clenched in a pathetic attempt to project masculine authority. "Apologize to my mother immediately, Clara, and then go out through the servants' entrance," he demanded, his tone laced with a venomous superiority that made my stomach churn. "You are ruining the most important night of our lives with your childish dramatics. We have esteemed guests here, and I will not have you embarrassing this family any further." The sheer audacity of his demand, expecting me to grovel after being publicly humiliated, was almost comical, a perfect reflection of his monumental delusion. Before I could formulate a response to his staggering hypocrisy, the crowd parted once more, allowing Isabella to glide into the center of the spectacle. She looked radiant in a shimmering, emerald green gown that clung to her perfectly sculpted figure, a stark contrast to my stained, draping silk. She didn't walk, she floated, exuding the effortless confidence of a woman born into extreme privilege and political power, with a sympathetic pout that didn't reach her calculating, icy blue eyes. She gracefully linked her arm through Julian's free one, completing the picture of a united, powerful front against the pathetic interloper. "Oh, Julian," Please don't be too harsh on her." Isabella purred, her voice dripping with fake, sickening sweetness as she looked me up and down with undisguised pity. It must be terribly overwhelming for someone of her humble background to be surrounded by such elegance and wealth. She probably just doesn't know how to behave in a magnificent estate like this. We should be forgiving of her natural limitations. Her words were designed to be a dagger wrapped in velvet, a calculated insult meant to assert her dominance and publicly claim my husband as her own. The affluent guests murmured in agreement, their faces twisted in synchronized expressions of disdain and amusement, thoroughly entertained by the pathetic downfall of the gold-digging wife. I stood entirely still, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of their collective judgment wash over me. Feeling the icy draughts of the grand foyer chill my wine-soaked skin, Isabella leaned closer to Julian, whispering something in his ear that made him smirk, completely disregarding the fact that I, his legal wife, was standing mere feet away. They were blatantly flaunting their illicit affair in my face, utterly convinced that I was too weak, too poor, and too desperately in love to ever challenge their authority. The sheer magnitude of their arrogance was breathtaking, built on a fragile foundation of lies that they had convinced themselves was indestructible bedrock. My mind flashed back to the crystal-clear security footage I had reviewed just hours ago, watching Julian and Isabella entwined on the leather sofa in my private study, laughing about how easily they were going to discard me once the estate was secured. They had planned this exact moment, this public crucifixion, as a way to force me out of the picture without Julian having to sacrifice a single penny of his imaginary fortune. I looked at the three of them, the abusive mother-in-law, the cheating, thieving husband, and the arrogant mistress standing united in their pathetic delusion of grandeur. They had pushed me into the deepest, darkest corner they could find, expecting me to cower in fear and beg for their non-existent mercy. But the only thing they had successfully accomplished was stripping away every last ounce of my mercy, replacing my sorrow with a razor-sharp, chilling resolve that was about to slice their perfect, fraudulent world to absolute ribbons. The murmurs of the elite attendees grew louder, a vicious chorus of hushed insults that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the magnificent entryway. I heard snippets of their cruel gossip, whispers about how I was a wretched charity case, a manipulative gold digger who had finally been exposed, and a desperate woman trying to cling to a lifestyle she fundamentally did not deserve. Several society matrons actually laughed behind their manicured hands, pointing at the stark, humiliating contrast between my stained, ruined silk and Isabella's flawless, expensive emerald gown. They were all complicit in this brutal theater of cruelty, eagerly participating in the social execution of a woman they deemed unworthy of breathing their rarefied air. It was a stark, sickening reminder of why I had chosen to hide my true identity in the first place, hiding from this exact brand of toxic, superficial venom that defined their exclusive, miserable little world. Are you deaf? Clara, I told you to apologize and leave, Julian barked, his voice rising in volume as my continued, unnerving silence began to crack his fragile composure. He took a threatening step forward, his fists balled at his sides, desperately trying to assert control over a situation that was rapidly slipping from his grasp. The crowd hushed, leaning in eagerly to witness the final, crushing blow to my dignity, fully expecting me to finally break down and surrender to his demands. Eleanor sneered triumphantly, signaling for the private security guards she had hired for the evening to step forward and forcibly remove the trash from her pristine palace. The heavy, polished oak doors of the foyer seemed miles away, and to everyone watching, I was a trapped, helpless animal surrounded by apex predators. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of the spilled wine on my lips, and felt the exhilarating, terrifying power of the Vance Empire waking up in my veins. Despite the overwhelming hostility surrounding me, I did not break eye contact with Julian, staring deep into the hollow, cowardly soul of the man who had sworn to protect me. I could see the tiny beads of sweat forming on his forehead, a subtle betrayal of his underlying anxiety as my unnatural calmness began to deeply unsettle him. He was waiting for the hysterical tears, the desperate pleading, the chaotic emotional breakdown he had meticulously planned to use as legal leverage against me in our impending divorce. But I gave him absolutely nothing, standing as rigid and unyielding as the marble statues that adorned the grand hallways of my multi-million-dollar home. The suffocating pressure in the room reached a fever pitch, the air so thick with tension, it felt as though a single spark could ignite the entire estate in a blinding inferno. The trap was fully set. The audience was eagerly watching, and all that remained was for me to turn the key and lock the gilded cage they had so willingly walked into. The two burly security guards, hired by Eleanor, stepped forward, and their hands outstretched to grab my arms and forcefully escort me out the servants' door. Eleanor's face was glowing with malicious triumph, her eyes practically begging for a physical struggle so she could fully cement my image as a deranged lunatic. But instead of retreating or fighting, I simply sidestepped the first guard with practiced grace, completely ignoring the second as I turned my back on the exit. The crowd parted instinctively, murmuring in breathless confusion as I began a slow, deliberate march toward the elevated marble platform where the string quartet had been playing just moments before. My wine-soaked silk dress dragged heavily against the pristine floor, leaving a faint, terrifying trail of red droplets that looked entirely too much like fresh blood. I didn't rush, letting the rhythmic click of my silver heels echo through the cavernous foyer, commanding the space with an unnatural authority that left the onlookers entirely paralyzed. The pathetic, submissive wife they had all been laughing at just seconds ago had vanished, replaced by a woman walking with the heavy, undeniable presence of an executioner ascending the scaffold. "Clara, get back here right now. Are you completely insane?" Julian roared, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp spike of genuine panic as my absolute defiance shattered his illusion of control. He took a few hasty steps after me, abandoning his protective stance beside his mother and his mistress. But he was too terrified of causing a physical scene in front of his wealthy peers to actually grab me. Isabella's smooth smile faltered, her perfectly manicured hands dropping to her sides as a flicker of unease crossed her flawless, arrogant features. She looked around at the murmuring elites, realizing that the narrative they had so carefully constructed was rapidly unraveling before their eyes. I reached the edge of the marble stage and ascended the short flight of stairs, moving with a calm, predatory grace that made the hired musicians nervously scramble out of my way. I stepped up to the gold-plated microphone stand left by the band's vocalist, wrapping my hand around the cool metal of the mic. A sharp, Piercing screech of feedback, suddenly blasted through the state-of-the-art sound system, forcefully silencing the remaining whispers and instantly demanding the undivided attention of every single person in the massive room. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." I spoke into the microphone, my voice steady, resonant, and completely devoid of the hysterical tears they had all been so desperately waiting for. The flawless acoustics of the grand hall amplified my calm tone, making it impossible for anyone to ignore the chilling composure radiating from the woman standing before them covered in spilled wine. "I want to personally welcome all of you to the magnificent Sapphire Cove estate, and thank you for taking the time to witness what will undoubtedly be the most unforgettable night of the Sterling family's lives." Down on the floor, Eleanor's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, her chest heaving as she finally lost her grip on her aristocratic facade. "Get her off that stage, security. Drag that crazy bitch out of my house immediately, before I have you all fired," she shrieked, pointing a trembling, jewel-encrusted finger at me. The two guards rushed the platform, but before their boots could even touch the first marble step, 4 massive men in tailored black suits seamlessly emerged from the shadows of the alcoves, forming an impenetrable human wall between the stage and the desperate, screaming matriarch. These were not Eleanor's cheap, rented mall cops. These were elite, privately contracted security operatives I had personally flown in and stationed throughout the property. Waiting for my silent command, Julian crashed hard into the chest of the lead operative, bouncing off the massive man like a rag doll and stumbling backward in absolute shock. "Who the hell are you people? I demand you step aside. I am the owner of this house," Julian screamed, his handsome face now a twisted, ugly portrait of terror and confusion. I chuckled softly into the microphone, the dark, amused sound sending a visible shiver through the crowd of socialites who were now watching the unfolding drama with wide, horrified eyes. "Oh, Julian, my sweet, delusional husband," I purred, leaning closer to the mic so my voice blanketed the room. "You have spent the entire evening regaling these esteemed guests with the brilliant tale of your unmatched financial genius, bragging about the massive investments that supposedly bought this incredible $30 million estate. But since we are all gathered here as friends and family, I think it is only fair that we finally discuss the true, fascinating nature of your magnificent wealth." I watched Julian's face drain of all color, his arrogant bravado instantly collapsing into a sickening, ashen gray as the horrifying realization of what I was about to do finally hit him. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, Julian Sterling is not a financial prodigy. He is a spectacular, catastrophic failure who currently owes over $15 million to some of the most unforgiving creditors in the financial district, I announced, my words cutting through the air like a sharpened scythe. A collective, deafening gasp erupted from the crowd of elites, the wealthy investors and society matrons reeling in shock as the Golden Boy's glittering facade was violently ripped away. I detailed his disastrous margin calls, his pathetic attempts to cover his mounting losses with desperate, high-risk gambles, and the absolute ruin that was secretly breathing down his neck. Isabella physically recoiled, taking 3 large steps away from Julian, as if his sudden, massive debt was a highly contagious disease. Her icy blue eyes widened in pure horror, realizing that the incredibly wealthy prize she had been proudly parading around was actually a sinking ship loaded with a mountain of toxic, inescapable liabilities. Lies. It's all vicious. Jealous lies. From a bitter, worthless woman, Eleanor shrieked hysterically, her hands clawing at her own hair in a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain her shattered illusion of superiority. My son bought me this magnificent house. He is a millionaire. And you are just a filthy, lying rat, trying to ruin his flawless reputation because you know he is leaving you for someone better. She grabbed Isabella's arm, trying to pull the younger woman back to Julian's side to present a united front. But Isabella violently yanked her arm away, her face twisting in utter disgust. "Don't touch me, you crazy old bat," Isabella hissed, glaring at Julian with a terrifying intensity. "Tell me she is lying. Julian, tell me right now that you aren't completely broke, or I swear to God my father will destroy whatever is left of your miserable career." Julian opened his mouth, desperately gasping for air like a dying fish. But absolutely no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the blinding spotlight of truth, visibly trembling under the collective, judgmental stares of the very society he had just sacrificed his soul to impress. "He can't tell you it's a lie, Isabella, because he knows I have the undeniable, heavily documented proof of every single fraudulent transaction he has made over the last 6 months. I continued smoothly, showing zero mercy to the pathetic, sweating man cowering below me. In fact, his desperation reached such a spectacular peak that he forged my legal signature to leverage our joint accounts, attempting to funnel the remaining funds through a complex web of illegal shell companies. The room erupted into chaotic, overlapping whispers, and the word fraud echoing off the marble walls as the wealthy guests began frantically pulling out their phones, likely messaging their brokers to immediately sever any ties with Julian's firm. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was now laid bare for the entire world to see. A desperate, pathetic criminal act disguised as a grand romantic gesture for his domineering mother. Julian dropped to his knees right there on the foyer floor, clutching his head in his hands as the crushing weight of his impending criminal charges and absolute social ruin violently shattered his perfect, arrogant world into a million jagged, irreparable pieces. "You thought you could steal my money, forge my name, and use my life savings to buy a mansion for your mother, while simultaneously planning to replace me with a politician's daughter," I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper that somehow silenced the entire frantic room. I looked down at Eleanor, whose legs had finally given out, leaving her slumped on the polished floor in a pathetic, whimpering heap of diamonds and ruined pride. The invincible matriarch who had poured wine on me just minutes ago was now nothing more than a terrified, broken woman, staring into the absolute abyss of poverty and public disgrace. The high society guests who had mocked me were now looking at me with a mixture of profound awe and deep, instinctual fear, finally recognizing the terrifying predator hiding beneath the stained silk dress. But the most devastating revelation was still locked away, waiting for the perfect, agonizing moment to completely obliterate their remaining sanity. They still believed Julian had successfully stolen the estate, and it was finally time to show them exactly who was the undisputed master of Sapphire Cove. even as the inescapable reality of his massive financial ruin crushed him against the cold marble floor. Julian desperately clung to the last, pathetic shred of his shattered ego. He slowly raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and brimming with panicked tears, and pointed a trembling finger at me. "You might have ruined my career, Clara, but you cannot take this night away from my mother," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperate, hysterical defiance. "I still managed to secure this magnificent property. I have the legal paperwork. The signed contracts that prove Sapphire Cove belongs entirely to Eleanor Sterling." Hearing her son's frantic reassurance, Eleanor seemed to suddenly reanimate, her head snapping up from the floor. She scrambled to her hands and knees, her diamond necklaces dragging pathetically against the stone as she glared up at me with renewed, "Manitshatret. That's right. This is my house. Bought and paid for. You are trespassing on my property, and I will have you arrested and thrown in a padded cell where you belong," she shrieked, entirely blind to the pitying stares of her former high society admirers. I didn't bother arguing with the raving woman. I simply offered her a cold, pitying smile and raised my hand to snap my fingers. A sharp, echoing sound that cut right through her hysterical shrieks, as if summoned by magic. The towering mahogany double doors at the main entrance swung open, instantly drawing the frightened gaze of every single elite guest in the grand foyer. Striding confidently through the threshold was Alexander Pierce, the most ruthless, feared, and notoriously expensive wealth management attorney in the entire country. A man whose mere presence usually signaled the catastrophic end of a corporate empire. He was flanked by 2 stoic legal assistants carrying heavy leather briefcases, their expressions carved from solid stone as they navigated through the sea of whispering, terrified socialites. The crowd frantically parted like the Red Sea, recognizing the legendary legal titan and instinctively backing away to avoid catching whatever legal plague he was carrying. Alexander didn't so much as glance at the pathetic, sobbing mess that was Julian, nor did he acknowledge Eleanor, who was still kneeling on the floor like a discarded rag. Instead, the feared attorney walked in a perfectly straight, purposeful line directly toward the marble stage where I stood, my white silk dress still dripping with the crimson stain of my mother-in-law's ultimate mistake. Reaching the bottom of the steps, Alexander stopped, adjusted his immaculate suit jacket, and bowed deeply and respectfully at the waist, a gesture of absolute submission that sent a visible, violent shockwave through the elite crowd. "Good evening, Ms. Vance," Alexander announced clearly, his authoritative voice projecting effortlessly across the silent room without the need for a microphone. "I have brought the finalized documents, the authentic property deeds, and the complete financial dossiers exactly as you requested." The name Vance dropped into the suffocating silence of the foyer like a live grenade, completely detonating whatever fragile composure the wealthy guests still possessed. The Vance global real estate empire was an untouchable legend in this city, a billion-dollar titan that owned half the skyline, and Isabella audibly gasped, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth in absolute, unadulterated horror. Julian stared blankly at the attorney, his tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of profound, utterly broken confusion as his desperate brain failed to process the monumental reality unfolding before his eyes. Vance. Why is he calling her Ms. Vance? Her name is Clara Sterling. She's a nobody, Julian babbled, looking frantically between the bowing legal titan and my cold, unyielding face. I simply nodded to Alexander, who immediately snapped his fingers at his assistants, prompting them to open their briefcases and produce a small, sleek, remote control. Alexander pointed the device toward the massive, gold-framed mirror hanging directly behind me on the sweeping grand staircase. Pressing a single button that caused the glass to instantly flicker and transform into a massive, high-definition, smart screen. A highly encrypted, legally sealed digital document materialized onto the massive display, bearing the unmistakable, watermarked seals of the state treasury and the undeniable signatures of the city's highest-ranking property officials. The document was magnified so perfectly that even the guests standing in the farthest corners of the cavernous foyer could read the bold, black text with crystal clarity. Allow me to read it aloud for those who are struggling to comprehend the situation, I said into the microphone, my voice dripping with a lethal, icy satisfaction as I turned slightly to gesture at the colossal screen. This is the singular, authentic, and completely finalized deed of ownership for the Sapphire Cove estate, purchased outright in cash, exactly 3 weeks ago, and the sole, uncontested legal owner of this property, and the ground you are all currently standing on, is Clara Vance. I paused, letting the monumental weight of that revelation physically crush the breath out of the Sterling family. I explained how Julian's sloppy, amateurish attempts to forge my signature and illegally funnel money had been instantly flagged by my private wealth managers within mere hours of his pathetic attempt. Instead of letting him get away with it, I had allowed him to believe his fraudulent shell games had worked, while my holding companies swooped in and legally bought the mansion right out from under him. His forged contracts were utterly worthless, useless scraps of paper that only served as heavily documented, signed confessions to massive financial fraud. Eleanor's fragile mind completely shattered at the undeniable sight of my name stamped across the digital deed of the mansion she had so arrogantly claimed as her own personal palace. She scrambled up from the floor with a terrifying Primal shriek, rushing toward the massive screen and frantically clawing at the digital projection as if her bare hands could physically erase the agonizing truth. No. This is a trick. It's an illusion. She's a lying, penniless rat, she screamed, her elaborate updo unraveling as she spun around to face her wealthy, terrified guests. Help me. Don't just stand there. I'll throw this insane woman out of my beautiful house, but the high society elites, the very people she had desperately tried to impress by publicly humiliating me, were now frantically stepping backward, looking at her with a mixture of profound pity and absolute, undeniable disgust. They realized with horrifying clarity that they had spent the entire evening sipping champagne and mocking the billionaire heiress who literally owned the roof over their heads, and they were utterly terrified of my impending, merciless wrath. The devastating reality finally pierced through Julian's thick skull, and I watched the exact moment his arrogant, entitled soul died right there on the polished Italian marble. The quiet, submissive, impoverished wife he thought he was brilliantly manipulating. The woman he had treated like an annoying stepping stone was actually the omnipotent puppet master, controlling his every single breath. The unfathomable billions of dollars he was so desperately trying to steal. The absolute financial security he had ruined his life to achieve. Had been sleeping quietly in his bed every single night for 3 years. He let out a gut-wrenching sob, crawling across the floor toward the stage on his hands and knees, desperately reaching out to grab the hem of my ruined, wine-soaked silk dress. Clara, please. Clara, my love, you have to listen to me. I was stressed. I was confused. I didn't mean any of it, he wailed. Tears and snot freely streaming down his perfectly handsome face as he begged for the mercy he had violently denied me just minutes ago. I love you. I always loved you. Please, you have to forgive me. I smoothly stepped backward, pulling the stained fabric of my dress out of his pathetic, grasping reach, looking down at the groveling man with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Your love is just as fraudulent, bankrupt, and utterly worthless as your pathetic bank accounts. Julian, I stated coldly, my voice ringing out with terrifying finality. I shifted my gaze past his sobbing form and locked eyes with Isabella, who was desperately trying to inch her way toward the grand exit doors without drawing any unwanted attention from my security team. She looked like a terrified, trapped rat, her glamorous emerald gown suddenly looking ridiculous as she desperately tried to flee the catastrophic wreckage of the Sterling family's social and financial annihilation. Leaving so soon. Isabella, I called out through the microphone, my sharp tone instantly freezing her in her tracks as the crowd turned their harsh, judgmental stares upon her. You haven't even had the opportunity to take the grand, official tour of my magnificent new home, and I insist you stay for the grand finale of this unforgettable evening. Isabella froze under the collective glare of the room, her elegant emerald gown shimmering as she trembled violently beneath the sparkling crystal chandeliers. My lawyers have already forwarded a comprehensive dossier of Julian's fraudulent activities, including your very intimate, legally compromising involvement in his attempts to hide stolen assets, directly to your father's political campaign manager, I informed her smoothly, watching the last ounce of color violently drain from her perfectly contoured face. I imagine a major, front-page political scandal involving his daughter conspiring with a broke fraudster to steal a billionaire's estate will do absolute wonders for his upcoming re-election campaign. Isabella let out a sharp, breathless sob, realizing that she had not only ruined her own pristine social standing, but had single-handedly detonated her powerful family's untouchable political legacy. Without another word to me, and without casting a single backward glance at the pathetic man still groveling on the floor, she hiked up the heavy skirt of her expensive dress and sprinted toward the towering double doors. She fled into the cold night like a frightened ghost, desperately abandoning the sinking ship she had so eagerly tried to captain just minutes before. With the arrogant mistress successfully banished, I turned my attention back to the pathetic, sobbing mess, still clutching desperately at the empty air near my ankles. I nodded slightly to Alexander Pierce, who stepped forward with the terrifying grace of a lethal predator, pulling a thick, meticulously bound stack of legal documents from his expensive leather briefcase. Mr. Sterling, you are hereby served with immediate divorce proceedings, filed aggressively on the grounds of gross infidelity and monumental financial abuse. the legendary attorney stated, his voice devoid of any human warmth, as he dropped the heavy files directly onto Julian's shaking hands. Furthermore, my firm has officially handed over the undeniable proof of your extensive wire fraud, signature forgery, and grand larceny to the federal authorities, who are currently waiting for you at your heavily mortgaged, entirely empty apartment. You are not just walking away from this marriage penniless. Mr. Sterling, you are walking directly into a federal penitentiary for a very, very long time. Julian collapsed completely against the cold marble, letting out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure despair as the inescapable reality of his impending imprisonment finally crushed his soul. Eleanor, who had been sitting paralyzed on the floor in a state of absolute, shattered shock, suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Julian by his tailored lapels and shaking him with violent, frantic energy. Fix this. Tell them it's a mistake. Julian, you promised me this magnificent house. You promised me I would be the absolute queen of this city, she shrieked, her voice cracking into a hideous, unhinged screech that echoed painfully off the vaulted ceilings of the grand foyer. But Julian was entirely unresponsive. A hollow, broken shell of a man who could only stare blankly at the polished floor, entirely consumed by the terrifying, suffocating vision of his own ruined life. I looked down at the cruel woman who had spent the last 3 years making my life a living hell. The woman who had proudly poured a glass of red wine over my head just half an hour ago to assert her imaginary dominance. You wanted to know your proper place in my magnificent home. Eleanor, I asked softly, my voice echoing clearly through the deathly silent room. Your place is exactly where you have always belonged, out on the freezing street, begging for scraps from the very people you foolishly thought you were better than. I raised my hand and snapped my fingers one final time, looking directly at the imposing, broad-shouldered leader of my private elite security detail. Remove this toxic trash from my property immediately, and ensure they are thrown out exactly as they are. They are not permitted to take a single item from this estate, I commanded, my voice echoing with the absolute, unyielding authority of the Vance global empire. The massive men in black suits moved with terrifying, robotic efficiency, swooping down upon the pathetic mother and son duo and hauling them violently to their feet without an ounce of gentleness. Julian was completely limp, offering zero physical resistance as he was dragged backward by his expensive suit collar, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared up at the magnificent chandeliers he would never see again. Eleanor, however, fought like a rabid animal, kicking, scratching, and screaming vile, incomprehensible curses as 2 burly guards lifted her entirely off the ground. The high society guests watched in stunned, breathless silence as the grand matriarch of the imaginary Sterling Empire was literally carried out the front doors, her diamond necklaces dangling pitifully as she was unceremoniously tossed out into the unforgiving chill of the night. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them with a definitive, echoing thud, permanently sealing the Sterlings out of my life and completely locking the elite guests inside with the monster they had just mocked. I turned slowly to face the terrified crowd of socialites, investors, and society matrons, watching as they collectively flinched and stepped backward under my cold, sweeping gaze. These were the exact people who had laughed behind their manicured hands, The people who had eagerly celebrated my humiliation and championed Eleanor's toxic cruelty just because they falsely believed she had more money and power than I did. I believe the evening's entertainment has officially concluded, I announced clearly into the microphone, offering them a chilling, perfectly polite smile that completely failed to reach my icy eyes. You have exactly 3 minutes to quietly vacate my premises before my security team begins forcibly removing trespassers. And rest assured, my financial firm will be thoroughly reviewing all of our ongoing business associations with every single person standing in this room come Monday morning. Absolute chaos erupted, instantly, as the wealthiest people in the city scrambled frantically toward the exits in a desperate, undignified stampede. Absolutely terrified of catching the apocalyptic wrath of the Vance Empire, within minutes, the cavernous, opulent foyer of the Sapphire Cove estate was entirely empty, leaving behind nothing but discarded champagne flutes, a ringing silence, and the heavy, metallic scent of spilled wine on the marble. I stepped down from the elevated platform, my silver heels clicking rhythmically against the floor as I walked past Alexander Pierce, offering the brilliant attorney a silent, respectful nod of profound gratitude for executing my brutal plan flawlessly. I walked slowly up the grand, sweeping staircase, feeling the heavy, stained silk of my ruined evening gown dragging behind me, finally allowing myself to release a long, shuddering breath of absolute relief. The suffocating weight of the past 3 agonizing years, the endless insults, the exhausting deception, the desperate need to be loved by a selfish man who only loved himself, was entirely gone, violently washed away by the brilliant, unstoppable storm of the truth. I stepped into my luxurious master suite, stripped off the wine-soaked dress that had served as my final, bloody armor, and stepped into the scalding hot water of the massive, glass-enclosed shower, happily washing away the last lingering traces of Clara Sterling forever. 30 minutes later, wrapped securely in a plush, white cashmere robe, I walked out onto the expansive, sweeping balcony of my master bedroom, letting the cool, salty breeze of the ocean wash over my clean face. I held a fresh, brimming glass of incredibly expensive, vintage white wine, swirling the golden liquid gently as I looked down at the massive wrought iron gate securing the perimeter of my billion-dollar estate. Standing out there in the freezing darkness, shivering violently in their ruined formal wear, were Julian and Eleanor, helplessly, waiting for a cheap taxi that would never come, staring up at the brightly lit sanctuary they had permanently lost. They looked so incredibly small, so entirely pathetic and completely insignificant against the monumental, sweeping backdrop of the Vance Empire that they had foolishly tried to steal through lies and deceit. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my crisp wine, savoring the exquisite taste of absolute freedom as I watched them finally disappear into the shadows, completely ready to embrace the brilliant, unshakable power of the billionaire queen I was always meant to be. The final echoes of the Sterling family's desperate cries had long since faded into the rhythmic, crashing roar of the ocean against the Sapphire Cove cliffs. Standing on my balcony, high above the world that had tried to judge me, I felt a profound sense of serenity settle into my bones. The mansion, which had been the site of my most humiliating moments, finally felt like it belonged to me, not just legally, but spiritually. It was no longer a stage for a toxic farce. It was a fortress, a symbol of a life reclaimed from the grasp of those who sought to exploit my kindness. Every corner of this place, which Eleanor had tried to turn into a shrine to her own vanity, now stood as a testament to my resilience. I was no longer the mousy, invisible wife waiting for scraps of affection. I was the architect of my own destiny. And for the first time in years, the horizon looked truly limitless. As the morning sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold, my phone vibrated on the marble side table. It was my chief of staff, confirming that the legal filings against Julian had been successfully processed by the district attorney's office. There would be no bail, no loopholes, and no escape. The evidence, the forged signatures, the shell company records, and the damning audio recordings of his private conversations was a mountain of truth that no amount of smooth talking could surmount. He would spend the coming years in a cell, stripped of the status he had sacrificed his integrity to maintain. Eleanor, left to face the world without her son's ill-gotten prestige, would fade into the obscurity she had always feared. Her social circle, having long since abandoned her to protect their own reputations from the fallout of the night's revelations. I set my wineglass down and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching as the first light touched the gardens below. The gardeners were already at work, tending to the rare orchids and manicured hedges I had personally selected. They didn't see a victim. They saw their employer, a woman of substance and power. I realized then that my decision to hide my identity had not been a mistake, but a necessary crucible. It had stripped away the superficial layers of my life and forced me to confront the reality of those around me. I had learned to distinguish between true loyalty and parasitic greed. The betrayal had been painful, yes, but it had also been the catalyst for a radical, necessary shedding of skin. I was lighter now, unburdened by the expectations of a family that never deserved me, and a husband who was never worthy of the love I had so foolishly, generously given. The story of the woman who wiped the wine from her face and revealed her true power would soon ripple through the city's elite, becoming a cautionary tale for those who dared to underestimate the quiet ones. But I didn't care about their gossip or their newfound fear. Let them whisper. Let them tremble at the mention of the name Vance. My power was not in their approval, but in the ironclad truth of my own worth. I walked back into my suite, the scent of lavender and fresh ocean air filling the room, and sat at my desk to begin a new day. There were contracts to sign, a business empire to lead, and a future to build that had absolutely no room for the ghosts of the past. The cycle of betrayal had been broken, and the silence in the mansion was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was the peaceful, golden silence of total, absolute control. As I opened my laptop, the first email on my screen was from the board of directors of my family's firm, awaiting my return to the head office. I smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached my eyes for the first time in an eternity. I was home, in every sense of the word. I was no longer playing a part. I was stepping into the truth of my own existence. The wine stain on the rug of the foyer would be scrubbed away. The name Sterling would be erased from the visitor logs, and the memory of the abuse would serve only as a reminder of the strength I possessed. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, breathing in the freedom, before placing my fingers on the keyboard to start my new chapter. The mansion was quiet. The world was waiting. and I was finally, truly, and irrevocably in charge. The drama was over. The curtain had fallen on the villains. And for me, the story was only just beginning.